Okay, today we are going to begin to talk about the biblical patriarch Joseph, the last of the Genesis patriarchs, the last of those big epic figures that appear in the Old Testament or in the book of Genesis. Now, we have begun with the stories of creation, dwelt in the garden with Adam and Eve, witnessed the broken fellowship with God, experienced the atrocity of one brother killing another. We waded and swam and floated with the flood, with Noah and his family. We've entered into a covenant between the Lord and Abraham, heard the promises of a great nation, seen the exclusion of eldest children in favor of the younger, and now we will come to the last third of the book of Genesis and the story of Joseph. Neglecting some of the earlier stories of their people and all the lessons taught and some learned, it is startling to see that the longest and most epic tale in the book of Genesis is this Joseph saga. Can you think of a reason, by what you already know, why this part of the family story at the end of the book might be given so much space in Israel's memory? This is almost a third of the book of Genesis to tell the story of Joseph. Why give it that much time and space in Israel's memory?
Maybe he's something like a savior.
Okay, something like a savior. Okay, that's a good hint. Because through this story, the nation will be able to survive. Yeah.
Well, it has, foreshadowings of going down to Egypt and the 12 tribes and stuff like that. And when you look at when they came out later, I think they make mention of Joseph's bones, and there's all sorts of, I guess it'd be types and shadows or typology, both in the Torah itself, but also later for us now.
Okay.
So it's kind of, it's like a very complicated saga.
Okay, great. It kind of encapsulates a lot of what will come afterwards.
It's a story of how God works through very difficult and unusual circumstances to work his will.
God works through unusual and difficult circumstances to work his will. That may be a key part of this narrative.
With Joseph ending up in Egypt, it also foreshadows the Israelites being in Egypt, and one of the key holidays, holy days, and remembrances is that Passover.
Mm-hmm.
So it does, these encounters, it does foreshadow that key event.
Very much so. Foreshadowing a key moment in Israel's history. The captivity in Egypt and God's eventual deliverance through the Passover and then leading them out. So a lot of these are really important ideas that you've expressed, and I think you've hit the nail on the head on several different boards. And that's a good thing, because maybe this house will stand now. It may also be like with us, we remember those best whom we are closest to in our family line. So I know my parents' story better than my grandparents' story, and I know their story better than my great-grandparents, and so on and so forth. And Joseph is much closer, his life, his story is much closer to modern day Israel, or to the current Israel that's telling this story in the book of Genesis. So that may also play a part of this. We've got a lot to cover today, and just a little time to do it, but clearly the ancient Jews understand this story as a key pivot point in their history. So let's explore Genesis chapter 37. So if you have that open in your Bibles, that would be a good thing for you to look at. Beginning at verse 1, Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Okay, so it is important as Israel tells its story that we know that this is a continuation of the ancient family line. We're not telling a new story, we're telling an ongoing story, a story that is unfolding. It is common to hear in the scriptures the phrase, the God of our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We are still telling their story through what comes next in Joseph's story. Look at halfway through verse 2. Joseph, a young man of 17. That's pretty specific. That's not Chronos time. That's, that is Chronos time, chronological time, and not Kairos time. We're going to be very specific. The storyteller wants us to know exactly how old this young man was. That he was tending flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. And now the lot falls to Joseph. In less than one verse, we learn his name, his age, his occupation, and then he rats out his brothers. Now, brothers and sisters never do that to one another, do they? We also learn that Joseph's father, Jacob, has children by other wives. In Hebrew, Joseph means he will add. Okay? He will add. Originating from the verb yasaf, meaning to increase. So if what we have learned about biblical names to date is any indication, there's going to be something about this young man's life that will lead us to believe that there is some type of increase that occurs either in his life or in the lives of those around him because he exists. That God has a plan for his life that will have something to do with adding to and increasing. Remember, people are named in the Bible sometimes for circumstances, sometimes for characteristics, and sometimes for the hope that the parents have in that child. We shouldn't be surprised to think that there may be something big in store for this teenager named Joseph. Look at verse 3. And again, stop anytime you have a comment or a question. My choo-choo train runs pretty fast down the track. But I can be knocked off to a siding if you will make a noise. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age. Loving your children should be natural for parents, but favoring one over the others can be disastrous. Where have we seen this before recently in the book of Genesis? Where a parent favors one child over the other. Jacob and Esau, absolutely. Genesis 25, it said Isaac, 25:28, Isaac loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And we saw how much trouble that created for the family. Joseph's grandparents showed this same favoritism toward his father and uncle. The pattern for family dysfunction has been set for generations. Look toward the end of verse 3. And he made an ornate robe for him. Jacob made an ornate robe for Joseph. Now, you all know the Broadway musical, don't you? Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Here is then how Jacob favored his son, by giving him this ornate robe. Verse 4, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Now, once more, the scripture lifts the specter of sibling rivalry. We have seen it over and over again ever since Genesis chapter 4 with those two sons of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel. And we've seen it all through these pairings. So many times, sibling rivalry has reared its head. And it is through this rivalry that there is much pain and suffering, but also in this rivalry that God makes his choices for in whom the family line will continue. But this rivalry is the basis for so much unrest and jealousy and heartache. The way the ancient writers express all this pain is brief and poignant. They hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Now, what were we taught about when you say something to someone? If you can't say a kind word,
Say nothing.
yeah, don't say anything at all. That will not be the case with these brothers.
Also, there was another, that when I said that coat was an emblem of royalty or position. So he broadcast to everybody, this is my chosen. And so the rest of the boys are really upset.
Yeah, that coat says a lot.
Yeah.
It says, this is the one. And yeah, everybody's going to be peeved, to say the least. Or, you know, in the Deep South, you might say, we were put off by that. And its implications. Verse 5. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. Everything to this point sets up the characters. Now we get into the heart of Joseph's story, that Joseph is a dreamer. Dreams, I think as we've discussed before, are one of the biblical means by which God speaks to human beings. Think of what that other Joseph, Mary's betrothed, experienced in Matthew 1:20. He receives a dream about the baby Jesus and his mother, giving him assurance and direction for the next steps in his life. Dreams can be prophecies as a means of understanding current events and future outcomes. Yet with the Joseph of Genesis, we discover his dreaming will cause even more ire from his siblings. And isn't it the case sometimes when one sibling is either favored over the others, or one sibling is more successful than the others? One sibling seems to have it all together, and the others can't quite figure it out. All these things can create tension and stress within the family. Beginning at verse 6. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. His brothers said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. And then in verse 9, then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Listen, he said, I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. Joseph's dreams of the sheaves and celestial bodies has this meaning, and it's very plain. We understand what's being said. The brothers and the parents understand what is being said. The meaning of these two dreams cannot be missed. They are so simple, like some of the parables of Jesus. Joseph will rule over his family. We too often think of God's word as being veiled and difficult to understand. But nothing could be further from reality. It is always the Lord's intention to bring order out of chaos. Think about the very beginnings of the universe and the story of God's people. And it is God's intention to speak clarity into confusion. It is plain to everyone in the story what the dream means, but who gets the blame for what God ordains? Who's going to be blamed for this? The 17-year-old kid, right. This is often the case with prophecy and with prophets. Jesus declared in Matthew 23:34, therefore I am sending you prophets and sages and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Others you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town. He lets us know what happens often to prophets. And certainly we see that is true, especially with some of the later prophets and even into the New Testament with John the Baptist. Let's pick up at verse 10. When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Joseph may be a visionary and conduit of God's declared future, but he's not very savvy when it comes to delivering the sacred message. He is either clueless about others' feelings or about the impact these dreams will have in their lives. Even his father, Jacob, no stranger to God. Remember, he's the one who wrestles with the angel for the blessing from God in Genesis 32. To Jacob's credit, he rises above the immediate emotions of the moment to reflect on the matter, to think about it, to ponder and turn it over in his mind. He has his own experiences with God that are strange. And maybe deep in his heart, he recognizes there's something else going on here. So rather than just blather on about it or punish my child for arrogance, I need to think about this. Oh, would that we thought first and spoke later. It's not always the case. Verse 12. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. So the storyteller is now setting up the very next scene. We've got all the backstory, and we've got the dreams. Everything's in place. There's tension in the air. So now let's set this in the real world. Let's send the brothers out to graze sheep at Shechem. Verse 13, and Israel said to Joseph. Israel, as you may remember, is Jacob's new name given to him by the wrestling angel. Recall that Jacob means grasp the heel, which is a euphemism for deceiver. In contrast, his new name, Israel, means to rule, contend, to have power, to prevail over. So the deceiver has now become the ruler who prevails. Perhaps it now makes sense that Jacob is surprised that his young son's dream indicates that the boy and not his father will actually rule over the family. This should be disturbing to the characters, and it is disturbing to each and every one of them. Picking up in verse 13, as you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them. Very well, he replied. So he said to him, go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me. Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. The pattern of the action here will be repeated later on in another biblical story, that of when Jesse sends his youngest son, David, out to check on his other sons who are on the battlefield between Israel and the Philistines. He wants to send him out to check on the brothers and bring word back. That is not an uncommon thing in the culture there, but it gets repeated a couple times in the Bible, setting up this eldest-youngest tension, this sibling rivalry. And the youngest one sometimes is just an innocent actor, doing what they're told to do, and yet God is preparing great things. Later in verse 14, when Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, what are you looking for? Apparently he was lost. He replied, I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks? Well, they've moved on from here, the man answered. I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Mine at 15 says, now a certain man.
Uh-huh.
I wonder who this man is. Is this Christ guiding him? Is this God guiding him? Is this an intervention of the holy?
Well, with the eyes of faith, you can certainly read that into it. But I think our hands are a little tied to say, well, it doesn't say that. And in other places, whenever there's some divine action, it usually indicates that they're wrestling with an angel, wrestling with the divine. Even though in that story, it says a man wrestled with him, but later in the story we learn that it is a divine intervention, that it is something, that there is something happening that is God related. Now God certainly, the Bible is clear that sometimes we entertain angels unaware, that you and I sometimes can be angelic messengers used by God to help direct others. Either way, the man either is just another shepherd who just said, oh, yeah, your brothers went that way, or, I don't know. Yeah, what do you think?
I think it was a divine intervention,
Okay.
but
Yep. Big question mark.
yeah, but that's what I got.
Lots of big question marks. So finishing up in verse 18, but they saw him in the distance. The brothers see Joseph in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. This seems a long, meandering journey to find the brothers, but it attests to Joseph's intention to be faithful to his father and brothers. However, we learn that their anger and jealousy have finally found the opportune moment to get even with this upstart. And are we shocked at this point in Genesis to think that a brother could even think about murder of another sibling, to have murder in his heart? If you are surprised and shocked, think of Cain and Abel.
Also, if you listen this here,
Mhm.
kind of reflects on when Christ was here. He talked about, if you hate your brother, and it just keeps evolving and evolving and evolving, it's the same thing that's happening here. It's kind of a reflection of the same situation.
Absolutely. And it just perpetuates itself. If there's not some way of putting an end to that anger and that hostility, then it just continues to live on. And sometimes it goes under the surface, but it comes out in passive-aggressive ways and sometimes in open violence. Jesus tries to interrupt that cycle. And later, John, in one of the shorter epistles, says, if you say you love God but hate your brother, you're a liar. If you say you love your brother and hate God, you're a liar. You got to have both. You have to have both. At this point, that moral lesson has not yet been learned. That spiritual lesson is not ingrained in all those who are acting out this incredible drama. Number 19, here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Can you hear the seething hatred? The way you read it might even convey that even more. They are livid. They're going to get even. Verse 20, come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. So, kill the dreamer and the dream dies? Well, is that true? Think of Martin Luther King Jr., I have a dream. Did the dream die? No. It may have been halted for a moment, but the dream has persisted. You don't kill the dream by killing the dreamer. You don't kill the message by killing the messenger. In today's terms, this would be conspiracy to commit murder. For the brothers, it's all about having been usurped by their younger brother with no concern over what the Lord's desire is. They're not thinking about God. Never crosses their mind. Or even that Joseph has no control over the message. The message is not from him, it is from God. God speaks in dreams, and Joseph is merely sharing what he has received. If self-serving or greed is the primary reason in the human heart to consider violence toward others, revenge as a motive must run a close second. Humans have this seemingly endless capacity to get even when they feel they've been wronged, whether rightly or just imagined. The great commandment, as formulated by Jesus in the Gospels and picked up from Old Testament strains, is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and
The second one is like unto it, love your neighbor as yourself, when he's saying the law and the prophets.
love your neighbor as yourself. This great commandment, and the second half of that commandment comes directly in response to the human impulse to get revenge. In Leviticus 19:18, it says this, do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. That's where that comes from, in direct response to the human inclination to get even. Verse 21, when Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. Now, it's really interesting to note that among the conspirators, there is doubt concerning the plan. Reuben is the eldest of Jacob's 12 sons, from where we get the 12 tribes of Israel. And he seems to have some affection for Joseph. The next to the youngest. Remember, Joseph in this case is not the youngest. He's the next to the youngest. He does have one younger brother, Benjamin. But Benjamin doesn't come on the scene at this point. So in terms of the dynamic, it is eldest and youngest. Older brothers and younger brother.
I wonder why Reuben through this whole story is there to protect. He tries to rescue him. Yet in the end, that his membership in the tribe of 12, his role was really put for naught. It's not like he was lifted up, but he was not as favored in the end.
Becomes kind of an inconsequential member of the family.
Right.
Yeah. Well, let's press on and see if maybe that we get a hint as to what the answer might be. I don't know if we will or not, but let's look at it. And I'm not putting you off here. Reuben offers a plan B. Plan Bs are good, plan A, no, that stinks. Let's go with plan B. An alternative wherein they don't shed blood. Reuben doesn't want to incur God's wrath, and being the eldest, he has some sway over the group. He deceives his other brothers in an attempt to save the boy. So look at 23. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. And then we get a note to make it more perilous. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. So now, how is Joseph going to die?
Dehydration.
Dehydration, exposure. He's going to suffer greatly. Joseph's life is still at risk. Now, Reuben's plan aside, for the others, Joseph will still die, but it won't be by the shedding of blood. In other words, we didn't kill him. We just pushed him into the cistern. The elements will take care of that dreamer. And how easily we can justify our actions or dismiss our responsibility because we can point to circumstances. Well, no, I wasn't there when he actually died. Cain's question in Genesis 4, verse 9, may have risen up in the brother's ears, or should have. When asked by the Lord, "Where is your brother?" Cain's response was, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" We see how that turned out. The answer was yes. Verse 25, as they sat down to eat their meal. Now, who brought the meal? More than likely, Joseph brought the meal, brought some provisions. They are feasting on the hospitality and generosity of their brother, coming to bring them news and bring them provisions, while he is somewhere over there in a waterless cistern. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Shechem is on the trade route, and this caravan is en route to conduct business in Egypt. This is how they make their living. The Ishmaelites are the tribes of Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn son by the slave Hagar, we discussed that, who was sent away by his father in favor of the younger son, Isaac. If this is a Hebrew irony here, that the eldest who was rejected is now entering a story where the youngest of the group is being rejected, we may never know. But further, these traders are from the brother's own family line, as Ishmael would have been their great uncle. Now, this is incredible to me. And it's all in the family, all the pain and the suffering and all the drama and all the deceptions. It's all here in one great family. And I am just floored that the story unpacks in such a dynamic way, and the writers and readers can figure how Israel's story is just like this. It comes together, it breaks apart, it moves here, it clashes, it comes back together, and then over and over and over again, they experience this constant breaking of the covenant. The covenant with God, the covenant with one another. And we're not yet at a point where the covenant is being mended. It is being fractured at this stage. Look at verse 26. Judah said to his brothers, this is another brother, the fourth in line. Judah said, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." And his brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. Now, apparently, Reuben has wandered off somewhere, because Judah is the one who takes up the mantle of leadership among the brothers and realizes the wisdom of not killing Joseph and senses an opportunity to even profit from the affair. Once money enters the equation, everything changes as greed kicks in. Now, Midianites and Ishmaelites are the same people, with Midianite being a subset of the larger group of Ishmaelites. So it's like Ohioans and Americans. All Ohioans are Americans, but not all Americans are Ohioans. So Midianites are a subset of Ishmael and that line. Joseph is sold for 20 shekels, the average price of a slave, foreshadowing what's to come. Commentator Craig Keener writes, "What is striking is the providential timing that both spares Joseph's life and transports him to an Egyptian household." That's kind of what you were hinting at earlier, Keith. The caravan is passing the brothers as they sit down to eat after throwing Joseph in a pit. Even in the midst of Joseph's suffering and his brothers' evil activity, Keener says God is at work behind the scenes. Knowing the future, God is at work to arrange for the future deliverance of not only Joseph and not only his family, but of many people in Egypt. And you can read that story in Genesis chapter 50. So to kind of dovetail on what Keith was saying earlier, that man that was wandering around, he's prone to believe that it was a divine interception so that Joseph doesn't get off track, so that God directs him in the right path. And even though these events are horrendous and painful, and he is sold into slavery, God is doing a great thing. We haven't seen yet what in the book of Genesis, except to know that Joseph's name has something to do with adding and increasing. So maybe that's what God has in mind as the Ishmaelites, the Midianites, carry him off in slavery to Egypt. We are almost out of time. Let's press on a little bit. When Reuben returned to the cistern, now this might also answer some of your question, Keith. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes, a sign of remorse and grief. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" Reuben's plan goes south when he does not simply advocate for and defend Joseph. Is this the reason he ends up becoming more inconsequential? That he didn't do enough. He didn't intercede. He didn't stand up for what he knew was right and true. Instead, tried to manipulate the circumstances to reach a good end. The means are important to the end. They don't justify the end. They are just as valuable and just as important and critical to what is finally accomplished. Reuben's plan goes south. Where can I turn now? It's the question everyone asks when they're in deep. What am I going to do? Now he is pressured to go along with the deception that will follow. Verse 31, then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." And I don't know if you found this a little odd, but I did. That there is an animal which is sacrificed to cover the sin of the brothers. Only this sacrifice isn't offered to God. It is intended to save their own skins with their father. They allowed Jacob to fill in the blanks of the story with his own assumptions based on this circumstantial evidence. There's the robe. It's got blood on it. It must be Joseph's. Oh my, maybe a ferocious animal has torn him to pieces. He's gone. And nobody challenges their father's conclusion, especially Reuben, who knows that that's not the case. Verse 34, then Jacob tore his clothes, again, that sign of grief. He put on sackcloth and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Jacob is inconsolable, as most parents would be when they lose a child. Remember, this is the son Jacob had shown great favoritism for. And in a sense, Jacob may bear some guilt as well for creating an environment of jealousy and setting these events in motion. Jacob's grief exceeds all of the false comforts coming from the conspirators. They know what really happened, but they're going, "Oh, come on, Dad, it's okay. It'll be all right. He's in heaven now." That's sometimes what we hear when we are grieving deeply. And it's not that we don't want to hear God's assurance that our loved one is okay, but there comes a moment in your grief when you just can't hear that. All you can hear is that you are grieving and you might be angry and upset. And nobody's going to tell you different. And some of us have experienced this in deep ways. Yes?
Well, I think it's almost worse because even today when people, a child or person goes missing, they, eventually they may find their remains and, have closure. But with this kind of thing, it's almost worse than if they had killed him. because there is no closure, and they are deliberately concealing what they know, and the fact that there's so many of them that are staying silent and watching their father basically torture himself
Right.
with all this stuff. And I just think they're pretty awful to watch that, to watch their own father go through that, and then they just don't say anything.
Right. Good insights. We've only got about 2 minutes, so I'm going to hustle us down the road just a second. Verse 36. Meanwhile, the Midianites, it's kind of like, the camera leaves the weeping Jacob and goes way back out on the trail again. So meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Now, what a curious way to end this part of the story. Joseph is now a slave in Egypt. That's not good. But curiously, he now has a ringside seat to the halls of power, as Potiphar reports directly to Pharaoh. If there was ever a great way to set up the next chapter, that's it. It's kind of like when you're watching just an intense drama on TV, and it ends with a cliffhanger. And then they say, tune in next week. And you go, but that's the way it is. And I'm ready to read the next phase of the story. I'm ready to get into it. Unfortunately, we've only got one more week, and there's a bunch more to this story. So we're going to focus just on one part of it. I would encourage you to read everything that follows. Shouldn't take you too long to read 38 through 50, so you get a sense of the whole story. But next week, we are going to zero in on what God is up to and explore chapter 45. Chapter 45, that kind of brings us to the point where we understand now what all this means, what's happening in the lives of these characters, and most prominently in the life of Joseph. So chapter 45 of Genesis for next week, but if you have time, read 38 through 50. I think you will benefit from that. So thank you all for being here today, and we'll see you in worship in a few.